the F-35B community now. Originally, we kind of hit copy and paste on how we do things around the ship because we were just like, yep, both aircraft land vertically and hover, so should be the same, right? And it kind of turns out after a couple deployments now, we're starting to learn a lot about the similarities and differences and ways that we can optimize employment of the F-35B on the amphibs. And so we're changing our qualifications to where if you're a Stovall LSO, you can control good weather, bad weather, heavy sea states, calm seas, as long as that individual in the cockpit is qualified at the ship.
Hello and welcome to the Fighter Pilot Podcast. I am your host, Vincent Aiello, call sign Jello, and joining me today in the Circle Air Group studios here at Gillespie Field in San Diego, California, is Major Brian Kimmins. Zach, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we know you're a Marine because I'm wearing red.
Yep.
I always do that for you guys. We put a little red in the background, and all right. Well, how long have you been a Marine?
Initially went to OCS back in 2006, summer 2006. So got commissioned in August of 2008, and then right to active duty after that for the basic school in Quantico. So ever since 2008, actually prior to that was in the Air National Guard at Lincoln, Nebraska. So SAC actually stands for Senior Airman Kimmins. Started out an avionics technician on KC-135s, and then somehow found a better opportunity to fly with the Marine Corps than the Air Force of all places. So turns out the recruiters didn't exactly have the full story, and the Marine recruiter was like, yep, get over here, take this test, and we'll send you right to flight training.
Terrific.
So here I am.
Okay. When did you start flying?
Started out in the Harrier, actually.
All right.
So I flew the Harrier for about a little over 4 years. Did a 2-year staff tour on a Muse staff, which was sold as a forward air controller tour, but had a lot more PowerPoint slides than actual aircraft controls. But then during that, picked up the transition to the F-35, and then been in the F-35 since 2019 now.
And the F-35B specifically?
F-35B specifically, okay. The Stovall variant.
Yeah, all right, which is what we're going to talk about today because, let's see if I get this right, episode 178 with Jamboy, all about landing signal officers. Mm-hmm. You reached out after that, and it's been a little while, but so we've been working at this. But you're like, hey, Jello, if you want to talk about the other LSOs, let me know. And I'm glad you did because I keep busting the stones of my co-host Tremors, who is only on the audio side of things. As everyone hopefully knows, we do these videos which turn into audio episodes on our podcast feed. And then in between all the videos that aren't so often, we still have those audio-only episodes. And so Tremors was a Sea Harrier pilot from the Royal Navy and an LSO as well, by the way. And so I always ask him, like, I don't get it. It shouldn't be that hard. You just stop, and if you don't like it, you back up a few feet, and then you come in and land. And so maybe once and for all, you can help school me on this because
hopefully so.
To me, like in my Hornet, I was coming down 130 knots and I got one quick flash by the LSOs. And if I did it right, great. I came to a stop. If I didn't, I either got waved off or bolted and came around for another try. So.
Yep. Yeah, that's the biggest difference I explain to people is compared to the CVNs, we stop and then we land, vice landing then stopping. So there's some parts that's a little bit easier, some parts that's a little bit more difficult, and I'm sure we'll get into it here. So.
For sure. And I actually, sometimes I do this, by the way. If it's something I just honestly want to know, I don't even make an outline because I'll just keep asking questions to hopefully satisfy everyone else's curiosities with mine. But I do have listener questions, and so some of those we might get into early because it'll drive the discussion. But so let's start with, so you said you flew the Harrier and the F-35B. How many, do you guys count, we'd call them traps in a Hornet or something? Do you guys count landings?
Yep. Yeah, so just shipboard vertical landings. Obviously, we separate the land-based versus the sea-based, but we do keep track of those separately. And not so much on the LSO side, controlling those vertical landings and takeoffs, but that's something we've started to track just a little bit more to kind of understand proficiency across the fleet as we train more F-35B Stovall LSOs.
Okay. And what would you say is the biggest difference between a landing on a ship and a landing ashore? And I mean, it seems obvious probably to us, but for everyone else, again, I mean, if you can hover, and by the way, I'll take a quick sidetrack for my own question. I just got done at the Miramar Air Show a couple weeks ago, and the F-35B demo was great.
Yep.
And there's a part of it, the pilot comes in, I assume it's a he. Who is it? Do you know?
Brembo Norris. Okay. Actually, a former squadron mate of mine in BMFA 211. So.
Well, we need to get Brembo here on the show.
They grow up so fast, right?
Yeah, they do. So we'll get Brembo on the show, hopefully, if we can. But anyway, so Brembo's sitting there, and he points at the audience, and then he goes a little left and a little right and up and down and round. So what that does to me is it conditions me to say, oh, he's got plenty of fuel to hover and plenty of time and plenty of control. And maybe, I don't know if you want to address that, you can. But again, if you can land like that, why is a ship landing that much different?
So it definitely adds a lot more complexity than just a vertical landing pad on a field. Obviously, the one difference, the ship's moving. The ship's having to account for everything else out there in the water, specific to our L-class ships. We've also got the V-22s, the 53s, the skids, and the 60s on there that we have to integrate with as a part of the overall air plan just on a day-to-day basis. So, anything from just making sure the ship's pointed in the wind at the right time when it's supposed to, because we do have that air plan that is basically our contract with the air boss saying, hey, at this time we're going to take off plus or minus 15 seconds. At this time we're going to land plus or minus 15 seconds, specifically as the fixed wing guys. So that's one of the more complex things, especially with all the different TMSs on there. But, also you factor in there, what are we doing for that flight? Are we doing just dedicated carrier qualification and, just beating up the pattern, trying to get that, minimum number of VLs to be qualified at the ship? Or are we going off flying a mission and then we're coming back having to hit a very specific fuel state where we burn about 450 pounds per minute in the hover. So when we're coming back with our minimum fuel on deck of about 1,500 pounds, we have about 4 minutes worth of slop in there. So that's kind of the other complexity that we factor in as far as fuel management. And the LSOs, or the STOVL LSOs specifically, are kind of there from pre-brief planning, briefing, execution, and then recovering back to the ship, and even debrief. They're just there as a part of the crew to kind of make sure that's all successful, or a successful evolution.
Yeah. So back to my point about Brembo's performance is that is a dedicated event, and part of that is a few minutes, it seems like, of hovering and showing what it can do. But to your point, when you're coming back at the ship's expecting you at a certain time because they have to steam into the wind, and then that's predictable for them if there's threats nearby or islands in the way or whatever. And then you need to have a certain amount of fuel so that, in fact, you can perform the hover. Because, right, if we're like in the Persian Gulf where it's super hot, and if you're carrying ordnance you didn't employ, now you're only going to be able to hover at a certain performance. Right. And then, like you said, just for the expeditious recovery, like Jamboy told us, you want to get on the ground or on the ship so that maybe your wingmen can, or all those other aircraft in the MU that you talked about.
Correct, yeah. And our biggest difference is obviously the L-class ships or the amphibs are not catabar, so we are at the mercy of one tram line for taking off and two vertical landing spots on the back of the ship specifically for the fixed wing. So, if we have a 4-ship, a 6-ship airborne, getting those landing spots cleared and everyone hitting their timing when they're supposed to is what makes a successful or not successful squadron that's embarked. And that's, again, just another bit of the complexity that the STOVL LSO can help manage from the tower. So, unfortunately, we don't have a platform on the port side of the ship that we stand on looking as sweet as the CVN LSOs do, but, we are protected from the weather up in primary flight control up there with the air boss. So it has its pluses and minuses, if you will.
Okay, so is a landing signal officer in an F-35B unit just one of the pilots like in my world where you just take a day and that's your collateral duty?
Yep. Okay. So it's, I don't want to say it's essentially the same, but we have 3 different categories of LSO. Backing up a little bit, this is specific to the Harrier, where we had just a basic LSO where anyone that was already qualified at the ship, you can control their takeoffs and their landings.
Any pilot? Or
any Harrier pilot specifically.
Okay, so I don't need to be an LSO Harrier pilot. I could just be a Harrier pilot. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. And then above that, you have an advanced LSO, which kind of starts to dabble in the training realm of being able to train pilots to go to the ship, qualify them at the ship, and then a little bit of LSO training. But then above them is the training LSO, who basically does all of that, getting the pilots ready to go to the ship, getting the ship's company ready to be familiar with the aircraft and the capabilities of the aircraft, and just the handling around the flight deck, and then also training up the LSOs because we're always training our replacement, is what I like to say. So like at some point, I'm not going to be the F-35B community's training LSO, and I'm going to have to pass the torch to someone else. So every opportunity we have to train more LSOs behind us is we're going to take that at the ship. Fast forwarding to the F-35B community now, originally we kind of hit copy and paste on how we do things around the ship because we were just like, yep, both aircraft land vertically and hover, so should be the same, right? And it kind of turns out after a couple deployments now we're starting to learn a lot about the similarities and differences and ways that we can optimize employment of the F-35B on the amphibs. And so we're changing our qualifications to where if you're a Stovall LSO, you can control good weather, bad weather, heavy sea states, calm seas, as long as that individual in the cockpit is qualified at the ship. In a previous life, if the weather got bad, you kind of needed the adult supervision of an advanced LSO or a training LSO over the shoulder, kind of similar, I think, to what Jamboy said about CAG paddles coming out when the weather kind of went south, and you needed that just extra experience there on the platform with them. It's a similar thing up in Pryfly for us in the tower. So with the increased capabilities of the aircraft and coming back to the ship and being able to get to a hover alongside, we're seeing a lot less color in passes getting to the boat. And so that, in conjunction with the LSO school or the Stovall LSO school that we're trying to stand up, that gets us the ability to kind of see a lot of those situations in a simulated environment and kind of get exposure to that before sending those LSOs out to the ship. So we took the bad weather, heavy sea states part of the advanced LSO and we combined it with just Stovall LSO. And then we changed the training LSO to just a LSO instructor. So that way, now we're down to 2 qualifications, simulator capability that we can create better scenarios and better training and honestly better standardization across the community. And we can put them through the rigmarole of bad weather, EPs, and having to deal with all that as LSOs before they even get out to the ship. So lately, with the last couple classes that I've run, more often than not, they get to the ship for the first time and then send me an email of like, well, I was really comfortable with all the procedures. It was just finding where Pryfly was on the ship and finding my way around the ship was the most difficult part. Yeah. So, which, I mean, is good and bad. Lets me know things I need to focus on a little bit more going through the academic portion of the school. But having not had this capability in the Harrier, I think we are making better LSOs more efficiently, ultimately cheaper in the long run because you're not having to control or at least watch the control of so many takeoffs and landings before you actually start doing it yourself as a trainee. So that kind of cuts down on time to train as well.
Yeah.
But
no, that makes sense. So if I understand what you're saying is now with the F-35, it's such a different platform that the same system didn't work, so now you're developing a school. And in fact, that's your role, right? I think you said your title earlier.
Yes, yeah. Right? So the Stovall Force Paddles, if you will.
Okay.
Basically, completely unofficial still at this point because the other line of effort I'm working through is just the establishment of a formal school and going through the appropriate processes in the Marine Corps with our Training and Education Command, the funding folks, trying to get a statement of requirement generated so that way they can throw funding and structure and all that stuff at it. So that's a kind of parallel line of effort aside from creating the academics and building a school syllabus to continue to, I don't want to say fix the problem, but to address the problem that we have of just not enough qualified LSOs in the F-35B community.
Is there resistance at higher levels, or is it just a matter of making them aware that, hey, this is different than the Harrier and this is what we need? And, oh, by the way, F-35Bs are expensive, so this makes sense.
So there's been no resistance at all.
Okay.
Actually, everyone, as far as I know, all the way up the chain has been 100% on board with this. And it's just a matter of letting the requirements processes play out and generating the Marine Corps order to formally establish the school, which then leads to the second and third order consequences of like lines of funding and lines of accounting and who's going to pay for what because this is a formal school now. So all that is stuff that I don't understand how it works. It just does sometimes. So I'm learning that side of the house, fortunately, as a part of my current job. But as I said, completely unofficially because we don't have the structure for the Stovall LSO School OIC, so I'm actually filling a BIC from some other unit right now that was a means to get me to Beaufort to actually get the ball rolling a little bit further. We kind of figured out we were in this situation in October of 22 when we had VMFA 225 was getting ready for their workups, and everyone was like, all right, who's the senior LSO in the squadron? And it was kind of crickets. All right, well, how are we going to fix this? And Colonel Mo Vaughn at the time was the MAG commander and told me, like, all right, Zach, you got no money and you got no real estate, but start a school for me because we got to fix this. I'm like, roger that, sir. We'll figure it out. So
that's the way Marines do it.
Yeah, right. Just found a problem and we're going to fix it somehow. So
take charge and carry out and go for it.
Yep.
Yeah. Good stuff. Well, I told you I was going to incorporate some of these listener questions a little sooner because it'll drive our discussion. The first one I think we've answered. It's from Niels Hansen, and these are, by the way, people that support the show on Patreon,
Nice.
so they help us keep lights on. Niels says, are there any significant differences between F-35B ops and AV-8B Harrier ops? And I think we've already talked about that, and if there's anything more, you can address it, but that is why basically you're here. Okay. And the next one is from Dutch Wood, who says, curious why do the vertical jets come alongside the deck and then move laterally for the touchdown as opposed to landing base leg final as on carrier flat tops? And you even said something about that at the very beginning, land and then stop versus stop then land. But the system you have, someone must have at some point decided it's the best, but it is different than what I do in my Hornet. So I don't know if you know any background on that or why is it different?
I don't know the entire background on why we do that. I think a lot of our original procedures in the Harrier kind of were born out of the UK operations and the way they did things when the Hawker Siddeley Harrier first came out in the late 60s. For us on the amphibs, especially daytime, I kind of alluded to there's one tram line for taking off for the entire ship, and typically with all those other aircraft embarked, you're going to have V-22s or 60s or skids parked farther up on the front of the ship, and if you don't execute your deceleration to a hover properly, sometimes you end up a lot faster at the ramp than what you intend to be, and coming over the back end of the ship faster than what you intend to be, not being able to slow down by the spot that you're landing at, potentially puts you in a situation where now you're slowing down into other aircraft that are sitting there parked. So that's one of the big reasons why we take that sidestep to port, as we call it, so that way we don't by that increased risk of the pilot just messing up the decel. And that wasn't an issue strictly for the Harrier. That happens in the F-35 as well, because as long as you still have a person in that cockpit, we're all fallible whether we want to admit it or not. But sometimes there's system degradations, there's low pilot essay, and sometimes we just end up overshooting the spot a little bit, or sometimes a lot bit more than what we intended.
Yeah.
So that's the primary reason for the daytime. So nighttime, previously in the Harrier, we would either cross over the stern to the landing spot, or if we were aided, we would sidestep to port as well. The F-35, we do unaided landings only at night to the ship as of right now, and that just has to do with our night vision capability in the helmet-mounted display that we have in the cockpit for the nighttime stuff. And this is actually something we learned from our squadron's deployment on the HMS Queen Elizabeth in 2021, where they have helicopters parked on the back end of the ship, so they always sidestep to port before they cross and then land while they're in the hover. And we recently, within the last 2 years or so, gained the capability to land at the aftmost spot at night, which we didn't have in the Harrier, because we have additional visual landing aids that have been incorporated. So now that we have multiple spots, we can recover with a little bit less interval between the aircraft. And our kind of answer to that was, well, if we just have both aircraft sidestep to port, then we don't have to worry about Dash 2, overshooting, coming over the back end of the ship, and then now hovering over Dash 1 if he's already landed or she's already landed.
Right.
That's kind of become the standard for us, both daytime and nighttime, is that cut to port. So
I'm thinking back to straight deck carriers like from World War II, where they had to put a big barrier up because if you missed the wires, that's where everything else is parked.
Yep.
And that's how we came up with the angle deck. So, all right, but hold on, take me a step back. Let's say you and I are out flying a section of F-35Bs and it's time to recover. Walk me through the recovery. Are we just splitting up, and I probably can figure the answer to this, but I honestly don't know. But I'm guessing it's not this. Mm-hmm. We're not just splitting up willy-nilly and you go and then I'll go. Are we coming overhead and flying a prescribed pattern?
Yep. So, depends on the weather, depends on the case. So day case 1, we'll come in as a section and we'll just execute the normal overhead procedure. First aircraft will go to spot 7, second aircraft will go to spot 9.
But we'll fly, like if this paper is the ship, we're going to overfly it and then take a break and
2 miles upwind, we'll break. Don't do shit hot brakes in the F-35B because, it takes about 14 seconds to get all the doors and transformer mode to complete. So you just end up way long in the groove with pissed off LSOs. So 2 miles upwind, the first aircraft will break, and then we get a 2 mile interval between the two aircraft, which gives us about a minute spacing once they're actually coming around the 90.
Okay, so you're turning 180 degrees, slowing, configuring for landing, and then as you're turning in, you said earlier something about offsetting. I didn't catch all the terminology, but do you just show up from the get-go off to the port side, or do you maybe come up the rear end and then the stern?
Yeah,
and
basically
then,
up the wake. So line it up at the wake initially, and then no later than about a half mile, you take that just slight cut to port.
Okay.
Where, if I had a picture of a LHD with me right now, I'd show you the outside edge of the port elevator is kind of our visual reference for what we're going to line up with. Yeah,
Okay.
so ideally we get about one aircraft width from the side of the ship by the time we come into a stable hover, and then once we got closure under control and we have got our good fore and aft alignment with the landing spot, then we'll cross from there. But
Okay.
off the 180, like all the terminology is essentially the same.
Oh, wow.
It's just a matter of kind of what we're doing with our aircraft versus at the CVN. So off the 180, we're going to slow to 150 knots coming around the approach turn, and then we're going to initiate the decel or the deceleration to the hover at about 0.8 to 1.2, somewhere around there,
Miles.
from the back miles from the back end of the ship. We have a couple different methods that we can decelerate to a hover for the F-35B specifically. For the Harrier, it was just manipulating the nozzles, which they conveniently put just inside of the throttle. So sometimes it was wait, do I have the right one? I don't want to go to idle when I mean to go to hover stop rather. But for us, we have a decel button, and depending on how we configure the aircraft, it will automatically decelerate to a hover to match the ship's speed, and we'll just arrive, beam the spot essentially, managing the deceleration itself. So you still handle the left and right lineup and the glide slope, but as far as the closure goes, the jet will handle that based on a system called JPALS, or Joint Precision Approach Landing System. And it's essentially a one-way communication from the ship to the jet saying, hey, this is my BRC or base recovery course, or the magnetic heading that I'm pointing, and here's my ship's speed. And so the jet just takes that information, and Skynet does everything it can to get you coast speed with the ship
For now.
by the time you get to for now, allegedly.
But
And
what
then-
about the wind, though? Speed
so,
is not the
yep,
only...
counts for the wind too.
Okay, so it does that.
Yep, so it'll just decelerate to match that ground speed that the ship is saying that it's going there. So that's ideally the primary way we do that. It's the most relief on the pilot, if you will. So if I don't have to think about my closure and my distance and all that, I can just focus on the other stuff. That's just one less thing to, I don't want to say one less thing to focus on, but one less thing to actively manage, as opposed to just passively scanning like, yep, still doing what it's supposed to. Yep, still doing what it's supposed to. Okay, cool. So the second means is going to be what's called just a decel to hover, where you manually enter the ship's speed, and then you manage the distance from which you start that deceleration. So that's where it's usually about 0.8, 0.7, depending on ship speed and winds. Higher ship speeds, higher winds, you're going to start that decel a little bit closer to the back end of the boat. A little bit slower ship speed and wind, or lighter winds, then you're going to start that a little bit farther. But then you're actively managing that DME and ground speed relationship to show up next to the ship coast speed with it.
Why would you use that method instead of the first one? Is that a degraded mode maybe? Or
Potentially degraded mode.
Okay.
If JPALS isn't available for whatever reason. However, it's a very reliable system, and I've had very good success with it. We will purposefully do it as a part of training, so then that way pilots can see. I think it's, I don't know if it's exactly similar to PLM with the CVN Hornet community, but you don't want to try to do it the first time when you really need it, having never seen it before. So as I kind of train some of the pilots going to the boat, I tell them you have to earn your auto decel to hover. So show me a couple good passes doing it yourself before you let Skynet take control for you and get you to the boat. So, and then if for some reason we have a HOTAS failure or just some other weird degradation of the aircraft systems, then manually manipulating the throttle itself is going to be how you end up getting abeam the ship, and that's going to be more of just a horseshoes and hand grenades. It looks like I'm slowing down. It looks like I'm not going too fast, and then you kind of massage it once you're abeam the spot. But those are the three primary ways that you can end up abeam the spot in a hover coast speed with the ship.
Now, up until this point, as we're talking through this scenario, are there any communications between, can it be zip-lip, as we call it, or is there some communications?
Yeah, it can be zip-lip. That's more like a sustained operations,
Right.
hey, month 2 or 3 deployment. Everybody's proven that they are proficient pilots around the ship, and then the deck crew has already proven that they are proficient in moving people out of the way and getting people where they need to be in a timely manner. So the typical comms, you'll get one call at the initial from the lead, and the air boss will give the winds and the clearance to brake. At the abeam, they are going to communicate then to the LSO, who's basically handed control of the airspace from the air boss for the duration of that recovery. At the abeam, they're going to tell me that they are one at the abeam, which I can see, so sometimes that call is a little superfluous, but they're going to let me know their gear's down, what their gross weight is, and then what their fuel weight is. Not every single landing am I really concerned with one or the other. It just kind of is situational dependent, because again, we have to be light enough to be able to hover, which our kind of advertised max gross weight is 38,500 pounds as our max hover performance. Obviously, we pad that for mom and the kids and try not to bring them in on the max number. that's my kind of final indication that they're going to either be light enough to hover or they're going to be heavy, and I'm going to have to wave them off and then sequence them back in behind whoever's recovering after them. So from that point, all they tell me is that they're either doing an auto deceleration to hover or a decel to hover once they initiate that, and then that kind of gives me an idea of what kind of closure should I be looking for as they're approaching the back end of the ship. If they're doing a decel to hover and when they called it, it looks like they're still pretty far out. Like, all right, well, I know they're going to trundle and they're just going to potentially end up in a hover about 0.3 miles behind the ship. It's like, all right, keep it coming. Or, they're screaming at the ramp when they called a decel late, and then now I have to tell them, like, idle boards, slow it down, and try and, it's letting me kind of mentally forecast a couple seconds ahead of time what my most likely calls are going to be. And that kind of ties into knowing each pilot in the squadron and kind of knowing what the standard trends are for each pilot. And then, knowing like, all right, maybe I got to speak a little bit more on this pass for so-and-so, or like, oh no, it's, the standard recovery for this guy, everything's good. I don't have to say anything. So from that point, once they get into a hover beam the ship and it looks like their closure's under control, there's a couple of visual checkpoints I'm looking for on the 35. One is our inner weapon bay doors will open up when we establish in jetborne or when we're approaching the hover. And that's kind of my initial, like, okay, cool, his closure's under control, he's established in jetborne, or she is established in jetborne, and I'm not concerned with their ability to now cross over the deck edge and land. So I'll give them a clearance to cross at that point. Even if I give it to them before they get a beam the spot, we still drive all the way up to the spot, make a 90-degree cross, and then we stabilize over the spot in about a 36-foot hover. Once they're stable after about 2 seconds in the hover, I'll give them a clearance to land, and that is kind of dependent on ship's motion. So if it's like heavy sea states and the back end of the ship is moving quite a bit, then I'm trying to time the pitch of the deck to give them their clearance to land, knowing that once they have that clearance, they're going to execute that vertical landing about a second or two later. And really what I'm trying to do is prevent a rising deck meeting a landing aircraft at the peak speed of both. So either trying to get them to land at the apex or whatever the scientific term for the bottom of that.
Nadir, I think.
Nadir, yeah. Trying to get them to land at the top or the bottom of that ship motion there to, treat the aircraft nice for maintenance and not have hard landings and all that fun stuff. So.
All right, hold on. I got to interrupt because questions are flowing through my mind. By the time the pilot is just about to cross the ramp, how much fuel do they have left at that point? Like, how long can they, could from that point, if for whatever reason, maybe someone runs out into where that person's about to land, maybe they don't need to wave off, but could you send them around to come do it again? I mean, is there that much?
In theory, you could. Again, if it's like sustained operations or, we're just going out doing unit level training, we're just out in the middle of the Pacific. If we're coming back for, a 2.0 set state, so 2,000 pounds of fuel left, in theory, I could wave them off. It kind of comes down to a judgment call then of, is this an issue that's going to be resolved in the next 20 seconds? Okay, cool. Then I will just give them delay hover or beam. And then they'll just sit there, coast speed with the ship in a hover, just staring at the landing area, being like, all right, any day now, I want to cross, I'm running out of fuel. Yeah. Or if it's, some sort of, moving an aircraft and the tug breaks and like the LA's fouled for, the foreseeable future, relative foreseeable future, then, hey, maybe it's, wave them off back in the pattern, give the deck crew about a minute and a half to figure it out, to 2 minutes to figure it out, and then bring them back there. The problem with that, depending on the fuel we're coming back at, is now they're potentially having fuel lights staring them in the face, or like a fuel critical warning light saying like, hey, you only got like 800 pounds left, so you got to figure this out. And it just kind of comes down to a risk assessment on the LSO, and kind of in that split second of what the higher risk thing is. Delaying a beam in a hover for another 45 seconds, or sending them back around and now having the kind of like increased cortisol dump into their system of like, all right, well, that didn't work that time, so now what do I do, sort of thing. And but then that comes back to kind of like the art of being an LSO and the voice comms and inflection and all that stuff. And I think kind of like Jamboy alluded to, you want to be that calm, soothing voice on the radio. Just I tell all the LSO trainees, like, you are the DJ on the light FM, taking everyone through the noon hour, getting to and from work. You just want to be nice and calm and cool, collected, because if you sound stressed on the radio, then all you're doing is making it worse for everybody that's in a cockpit at that point. So
Did you say 450 pounds a minute in the hover?
Roughly. Yep.
Is it less if you send me around? Let's say I'm your pilot. Am I going to be a little more efficient if I'm actually flying now?
You will be.
Okay.
So it'll drop to anywhere from, we'll just call it 275 to 375, somewhere around there.
So not quite half, but
not quite half, but
less.
A little bit less. But
and then another question is the F-35B is in-flight refuelable, and I don't know if we want to go on a big tangent here, but on a carrier, and I've done this because I couldn't land, is I can go up and meet a tanker, which is indigenous to our air wing, and get more fuel. The Marine Corps, I don't think, has that. Is there anyone working on something for that?
I think they've kicked around ideas about throwing a refueling system on MV-22s. I'm just going to completely sidestep that. I'm going to sidestep that topic. So it's kind of a different mentality for us. Boarding rate is not really a thing in the Stovall community because, again, like I said, you stop and then you land. And I decided to track this during our 2021 deployment on the HMS Queen Elizabeth because the issue of boarding rate was raised. And over the course of 1,600 vertical landings, roughly, we had 3 wave-offs. And that means that about 1,597 all landed on the first time. And so it's kind of a different mentality there. And it's, in theory, there are tankers dedicated to the Marine Expeditionary Units that are embarked on the amphibs or the LHD, LHA class ships. Whether or not they're there at the moment of recovery that you can then just, jump up and grab some gas, based on the fuel states we're coming back at, is probably not going to be a thing because then you're going to burn all that gas you could have used to go back around the pattern one more time to do a vertical landing, just trying to get up to the tanker and get plugged for the Stovall guys. So.
Okay. You were on the Queen Elizabeth deployment?
I was, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Can we do a tangent on that real quick?
Yeah, absolutely.
Did they let you drink?
They did, actually. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Can we tell the Navy that, look, it worked, or did it not?
No, it actually worked. So a lot of things went into that. So we had an excellent Sergeant Major Beckett, who basically spelled it out for all the Marines and kind of did the whole, Joker from The Dark Knight, snap a pool cue, throw it in between the Marines and say, be the one that screws it up. You're not even going on this deployment. So we started out with about 270 or 80, I think, and we had to cut it down to about 250, 255 to go on the deployment. We had a stacked deck going into that deployment pretty early on, and it was just one of those like, hey, if you mess it up, you mess it up for yourself. We're going to treat everyone like an adult, and we're going to abide by whatever the UK rules are on the ship. And I think we didn't have any incidents on the ship. One Marine got a slap on the wrist of like, hey, you probably shouldn't be really hungover showing up to formation in the morning. But yeah, for the most part, no issues.
All right.
And everyone, acted accordingly and how they were supposed to, and kept our honor clean.
That's
if you
good.
will, so.
Well, and that's the, dare I say, funny or lighthearted question I want to ask. But the less so lighthearted question is, you didn't come back with all the jets you went with, as I understand.
The U.S. did.
Okay, so I don't know much about it. I just know I saw
okay.
footage of an F-35 that did not launch, and I don't know if you can comment on anything about it.
That was the tail end of the deployment as we came back through the Suez, just out of the Suez, a couple of days. And it's already been documented in a couple of different documentaries that are out there about that deployment. I'm not really sure what to say about that.
All right.
It is a statement of fact that we came back with one less F-35B for the deployment. It was, unfortunately, the UK's F-35B, BK-18. And, one of the interesting things to come out of that, as soon as the pilot, Hux, who shelled out, the parachute caught on the light housing on the top right of the ramp on the front of the ship and basically like swung him right back to the flight deck. So the timeliness of his ejection was very good. Instead of him, waiting another second or two and end up going under the front of the boat, he swung back onto the flight deck and they pulled him out and ran him down to medical. And as all good fellow JOs do, they ended up bringing him beer later that night, which I think statute of limitations were good now and people can know that. But they ended up sneaking him some beer.
All right.
I think later that night. But
well, as is the case with all mishaps, there are causal factors that are explored, and then hopefully it won't happen again. But right, this is a dangerous business.
Oh, yeah.
And whether it was just an aw shucks, which I hope it wasn't, or a literal issue of things lining up, so which may not happen again. But either way, someone I'm sure has learned, and I'm sure there's processes in place.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so let's go all the way back now to our notional pilot sitting just about ready to cross over steel. What does that pilot looking at that point? Is it all inside? Is it outside? What else is there? And I think that, by the way, is this next. Anyway, I've got a question coming up on that, but when we get to it, we can pass it up. But what's the pilot doing once the wheels are crossing steel?
Yep. So we're still in the day case one, weather recovery right now. So there's a combination of things. In the groove, we have the OLS that will fly as well. So we'll fly the optical landing system, or the IFLAWs, but the LHD version. So we'll fly a 3-degree glide slope to the back end of the ship and then level off to drive it in at about 105 feet above the water, which puts us about 35 or so feet above the flight deck itself. So combination of things we're looking at, visual landing aids of the crow's foot on the spot. So spot 7, you've got the yellow tram line that goes all the way up the ship. You've got the white crow's foot, which the rotary wing folks and tilt rotor folks use to land on, and then we essentially just use that athwartship line, which is the one going from port to starboard. Didn't go to the academy, I just know that word because it sounded funny one day, and I was like,
it is funny.
I don't remember that.
Yeah.
Anyways, so the line going from port to starboard on the landing spot, that's what we're going to line our seat over. So then that is basically our good fore and aft alignment, and then as we're crossing, Spot 7 has what's called a hover position indicator just below pry fly on the back end of the ship. And so long as you're over the tram line, centered left and right, you are at a 36-foot hover, you should see what is a centered ball on the hover position indicator, which is essentially just a light out on a bracket that sits in front of other lights and is really confusing the first time you look at it. But once you move the aircraft back and forth or left and right, up and down a little bit, then you're like, oh, okay, it's just shapes and trig or something like that, but just make the thing look like how it's supposed to, and then you're over the correct landing spot there. For spot 9, which is further aft, we don't have a hover position indicator for that, so it is solely left and right on the tram line. Your fore and aft is a line that extends further from the landing spot all the way across the starboard elevator, and then you just have your rat out for a 36-foot hover. There's some kind of gouge visual checkpoints of, hey, if you put the top of the pry fly windows even with the horizon, then that should give you a good up and down alignment as well. And that's kind of a little bit more for like pitching deck. The amphibs move a lot more than what the CVNs do. And because of that, you'll end up with pilots that just chase left and right or up and down or fore and aft because they're just staring at this light thing, telling themselves, like, I have to make it look like what it's supposed to look like. But the whole time it's like moving to and away from. So they just end up like chasing the whole thing. But so those are the primary visual landing aids. And then specifically for the execution of the vertical landing, once the LSO gives the clear to land, all we're doing in the cockpit is just pushing the stick full forward, which feels very uncomfortable coming from the Harrier. Instead of like pulling power to descend, now I'm just pushing full forward and hoping for the best. But once we execute that vertical landing, or we start the execution of the vertical landing, then it becomes a quick scan off to the hover position indicator, down the tram line, hover position indicator, tram line, and we basically do that for the 6 or 7 seconds it takes to execute the VL to make sure that we're nailing that vertical landing position over the spot. Slightly easier at spot 7 because we're just looking off 45. Spot 9, we're looking like all the way out to the starboard elevator and back forward. So it's a little bit more of a scan, but still nothing too terrible to do.
And you said full forward stick, so there's no concern about completely chopping the throttle and just coming down like a turd off a tall moose, as they say?
Yeah, so it becomes this weird combination of like a cyclic and collective sort of thing from the rotoring world, where my throttle now becomes my ground speed controller, not necessarily more thrust or less thrust out of the engine. And my stick becomes my up and down and left and right position keeping.
Which it always was, right? So they made that decision in the F-35 development I read about. So, okay.
Yeah, so then it's just a matter of I push it all the way forward to the soft stop, and it will execute, or it will command a 7 foot per second rate of descent, which ends up about 420 foot per minute rate of descent all the way to touchdown. Now, difference between the Harrier, we pull a little power, put a little bit of power back on to try and catch that vertical landing, and then as soon as we felt the wheels touch down or we heard the LSO say idle, we just rip the throttle to idle. As soon as we touch down at 35, the jet itself will backdrive the throttle, put you at idle, and then now you're just waiting until you can convert out, shut all the doors. I keep go like this because that's where the button is in the cockpit. To where you can convert out, shut all the doors, and then now you're established in what we call mode 1 or CTOL mode, essentially, before you start taxiing around the flight deck from there.
Okay. And so at that point, you feel the landing. Are you looking for like a yellow shirt
There's a yellow shirt out at your 45. So
Okay.
as soon as you touch down, they're already trying to get you out of the way. But you're like, oh, hold on, I got to convert and make sure everything's good. Get nose wheel steering and high gain and all that fun stuff. They're waiting for you, and the pilots know, like, as soon as I look over here and I convert, now I'm looking over here because I'm starting to get some taxi directions, because depending on how many aircraft are behind it, it's not a CVN launching, a massive wave of airplanes. We have maybe anywhere from 6 to 10 aircraft, F-35Bs embarked on the amphib. So, at most it could be up to 8 aircraft, but they're still, trying to move with the purpose and get everyone out of the LA as quickly as they can. So.
If I landed in my Hornet and I was carrying live weapons, I'll make a right turn and they'll have this alley protected with all these deckhands. And the first thing they'll do, the yellow shirt will direct me to that, but then they'll hand me off to a red shirt to de-arm me. Yep. Is there anything like that in the F-35?
There is not. So because of all the safety interlocks in the aircraft itself, we can actually taxi off the spot, taxi into the aft slash, and go park, and then our Ordnance Marines will safe us up once we're actually in the parking spot and chalked and chained. Same thing on the way out. They'll arm us before we even taxi out to the tram line, to the stow position, and then launch from there. And it's a combination of, are you in a weapons master mode? Is your master arm on? Are the weight on wheels switches disengaged? Have you pulled the trigger, pushed the pickle button, and like 3 or 4 other things that have to happen before something bad like that. Everyone goes back to the USS Forrestal incident,
of course,
and that's just one of those things that, to the F-35 community's credit, has been kind of engineered out of the platform.
Good.
So
now, getting back to Spot 9 real quick, and then we'll maybe go to bad weather or night. Is that something like, if you've got I assume you use the term nugget like we do, like from first cruise or whatever. Will you arrange where people are landing based on their experience? Like, will you kind of preserve the Spot 9 for maybe the saltier pilots? Or?
Potentially. It just kind of depends on what's going on. If they've had a rough couple weeks or something, the visual landing aids are slightly better at Spot 7. Spot 7 in heavier seas will move, a little bit less than Spot 9, just in the up and down motion of the deck. But, once they're carrier qualified, they've seen landings at both spots during the course of the carrier qualification process. So really it's just, am I lined up left and right? Am I about 36 feet in a hover? Am I lined up fore and aft? Yes. Okay. Even if they panic, we have this mode of the aircraft called TRC, or Translational Rate Command. I'll engage it by hitting the Pete span on our throttle there, and you can hit that, take your hands off the throttle and the stick, and just sit there with your arms crossed, and the jet will keep the same speed as the ship over that spot until you command a landing or until you run out of fuel, whichever comes first. But
let's do the landing first.
So there's times where people may think they have that mode engaged, but they don't, which leads to some a little bit more color, because instead of a like, hey, this is my position keeping mode, now you get into a, hey, I'm requesting acceleration in specific directions to correct my position. And the biggest difference is when you have TRC engaged, you put the stick all the way to the right and you just hold it there. And the jet's like, all right, cool, we're crossing to the right. And then when you get over the spot, you just let go and the jet will stop and maintain that. If you don't have that and you put the stick out to the right, now you're telling the jet, hey, I want you to increase my rate of acceleration in that direction. And then now it gets very uncomfortable as you're like racing toward the aircraft in the aft slash, and you got all the people down there on the flight deck going like, the hell is this thing doing? That's where it gets a little squirrely for some of the less experienced boat pilots at times. But honestly, if they're carrier qualified, there's no reason I can't send a brand new guy to Spot 7 or brand new gal to Spot 7 or Spot 9 with any concern for their ability to execute that landing.
Now, if the sun goes down, not that it's going to happen without us knowing about it, or the weather comes in, I'm guessing we're doing something different than a Case 1. So What does that look like?
Yep. So our Case 3 recovery, we call it the LH2, which is basically, think of it kind of like an overhead instrument approach, always staying within about 8 miles of the ship, and ultimately ending up on about a 5-mile final, 1,200 feet. Gear down, converted to mode 4, and flying about 150 knots. The JPALS system that tells us, where the ship is, how fast it's going, what direction, all that, is also our precision approach capability. So it's kind of similar to ICLS, but slightly different in its symbology that it presents to us. But we can shoot that precision approach down to 200.5 behind the ship, and then we'll do that until we either break out and we make all the standard ball calls and all that, or Clara, unfortunately, if we get to that point.
Clara means I don't see the ball.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah.
So there's been Clara or Clara ship calls that I've heard on the radio before, which are always fun. Jamboy actually talked about the whole like 99 taxi lights on sort of thing. Similar thing for us as well. Granted, you get a little bit more decision space when the aircraft is slowing down to a dead hover, being the ship, than you get at the CVNs. But not so much of an issue here off the coast of San Diego. But some of the LSOs that have been out in Japan at Mag 12 and done the 31st view, they have told me in no less than probably 3 or 4 different times that they've run into issues where you launch good weather, then we found the fog bank. Hey, I need you to turn your taxi lights on because we don't got to divert and we got to get you back on the ship. Yeah. So some of that actually, the decision to do that, at least in the Stouffville side, kind of came out of, there's a story in the book, Hammer from Above, about just marine aviation in general in the early days of OIF. And there was one specific story in there where they talk about Harriers launching, sandstorm rolls in, and they were like the only 3 aircraft that launched that day. Everyone else in the coalition was like, no, there's sandstorms, we're not launching. And they're like, well, don't have fuel to divert, got to get back on the ship. And, to the LSO's credit, it was like, hey, get your taxi lights on. And then, seeing Harriers, half mile off course, just kind of way out there, and then talking them back on, recovering all 3 of them, some of them on fumes. But that's kind of the one situation where a lot of us will, that were Harrier guys previously, kind of look back to as like, that's always your out when you have very poor visibility. And the fog banks roll in or whatever, is like, get the taxi lights on. I really hope I see you as the LSO. Otherwise, this is going to get pretty interesting shortly after. But
so for the case 3, and again, you talked about 200.5. So for those who maybe aren't aware, so theoretically, the lowest clouds are 200 feet above the water, and the visibility is at least a half a mile. And so if I'm doing that approach and I get to, I think you said 1,200 feet in 5 miles, then I'm just probably flying a glide slope down. Yep. And then instead of, like in my Hornet, coming over the ramp and landing, I'm still going to probably slow it almost coast speed and then step over to the left and then back to the right? Okay.
Yep. Yeah. So a half mile is kind of the last point, last-ish point at which you're going to take that little cut to port. And it's not an aggressive, like left wing down or anything like that. It's just, a couple degree heading change. And then, now you're just lined up over on the side of the ship. So basically, as soon as you can see the boat at that point, if and when, hopefully you break out. Otherwise, if the LSO has seen your taxi light, then they can kind of drive you from there. But that's going to be our standard bad weather, or even our standard nighttime recovery, because we don't have. Well, we have a night case 1, which is an aided recovery, but kind of back to my previous comment about aided recoveries to the ship with the 35. Eventually, we'll get there, but right now it's all unaided, and that essentially teardrop approach to the straight in. So.
Okay. If I land and go down the ready room, do I expect the LSOs to come by and give me a grade?
Oh, yeah. Yep, okay. 100%. So all
what are we grading?
So we are basically the same. I don't want to say basically the same. Essentially the same as on the CVN side. Pattern. The grading starts potentially from takeoff, depending on, if you make dumb calls on the radio or you embarrass yourself on the radio, then we'll start fining you appropriately. But basically, grading starts at about either the ball call for the night case 3 or really the execution of the instrument approach. So, good weather, I can see the aircraft flying over the ship, so I know if they're actually making their timing or not. So it's either a note of like, were we actually on our time or not? But daytime, from the abeam all the way into the landing is what we're grading there. So everything from, pattern, altitude, are you high, low at the 90? Did you overshoot your start? Did you angle? Are you high start, low start? Are you long in the groove, not enough straightaway? All those comments still apply. And then a lot more of the like glide slope profile and the rate of deceleration as you're approaching the back end of the ship. So we still use the, in the middle and close at the ramp, abeam the spot. We're judging if they have the correct beam width next to the ship. So are you one plane width abeam the ship like you're supposed to be? Are you 2 to 3 because you're slowing down towards this big metal thing and you're scared and you kind of drifted away from it because I don't want to land there, but I do. And then even the overshooting or stopping short of the spot, how stable of a hover you have over the spot. Are you in a rough hover where you're chasing that HPI that's moving to and away from you? From my position, I should see just a stable F-35 on the horizon as they're over the spot. And if they're just like up and down and all over the place, then they'll get a rough hover comment. And then, are we drifting in the execution of the vertical landing, forward, aft, left, right, etc.? And then are we actually landing on the spot, or are we landing forward, aft, left, right? And then any sort of comments with the pilot's interactions with the deck crew. So are you actually listening to what the yellow shirts are telling you as they're trying to taxi you around the deck, or are you not making timely inputs to the aircraft? So we're essentially judging, looking down from pry-fly all the way up until aircraft shut down, and then they go back inside.
Okay.
And a lot of it comes down to the, I don't want to say we're kind of like the apex predators on the LHDs as the fixed wing guys and gals, but we don't have a lot of fuel when we come back, so the whole like making your timing plus or minus 15 seconds, making all the correct comm calls the way they're supposed to sound, executing all the correct procedures, like all that just goes into the mentality or building the mentality of, perfection is never going to be achievable, but we should be pretty damn close by the time we, sail on deployment. That translates into the working relationship with the air boss on the amphibs, where if I tell the air boss, like, hey, here's our contract, it's the air plan, we're going to abide by this, and we do that, 99 times out of 100, and we get to that one day where it's like, hey, boss, issues with this aircraft, do you mind if we get a 5-minute slide? Oh yeah, no problem, like whatever, you guys are going to do what you say you do. And I think one of the biggest compliments I had from an air boss on it was my second deployment on the USS Boxer, just standing there in the tower waiting for the jets to recover, and he just looks at his watch and he's like, hey, Sack, initial. And then the aircraft called initial. I'm like, I'm so happy right now. Thank you guys for not fucking up your timing. So that's what we try to get to is just, anything we say we're going to do on time every time.
It's professionalism.
Exactly, yep. Yeah. And just to build those good working relationships, because again, like we're 2,000 Marines on a U.S. ship, or a Navy ship rather, it's still their boat, and if they want to close the airport because we're messing things up, that's their prerogative. So we got to play nice and team build and all that stuff, which is just another unique thing about the L-class ships versus on the CVNs.
Yeah. We had Marines in our air wing, but all right. So if there are grades, I assume there's some sort of competition or acknowledgments of those whose grades are better.
Yep.
All right, very good.
We don't really have a top hook, top nozzle, I guess would be the equivalent. But no, at the end of every day, kind of going back to your question, at the end of every day, we'll get all the pilots together. We'll have anywhere from 12 to maybe 18 in the squadron on the ship. We'll get all the pilots together and we'll just cover the grades as a ready room. So I will do it that way. Again, like every situation we encounter is a learning opportunity. So if the really experienced guy had an issue today and we can learn something from it, because the young guys weren't flying that day, they can still be there and learn something. Or, if there's trends in procedural errors that we're making, getting everyone together, potentially identifying that earlier rather than later, again, goes to just making the entire ready room better. So most any opportunity we can take to do that, we will. Our rotary wing and tilt rotor brothers and sisters will kind of make fun of us because we're just in the back corner of the wardroom at Midrats, gathered around in a circle, just telling each other how much we suck that day. But
they all think you're telling each other how great you are.
Yep, yeah, exactly. But yeah, all in the interest of just making better carrier or boat pilots. Rather.
Yeah. Well, it's such a consequential activity. I mean, the aircraft are expensive. If you bang one up, it's going to probably explode and kill people, and it's just so it's the right thing to do, and that's the military aviator way.
Oh, yeah.
All right, I want to get back to the questions. We answered Derek Burney's about the landing system, and you also answered Mike Bridges about the synthetic vision available, so that you said is coming.
So they might be asking about the whole, can you look through the bottom of the F-35 with your helmet thing? Yep. So we have the distributed aperture system, which is basically like our IR cameras around the aircraft. That can get projected into our helmet-mounted display. So yes, in theory, I can just look down and see the IR world around me projected in the helmet. But I have to turn that on to be able to actually use that. Usually only use it at night, but it's another nighttime capability that we have compared to the night vision camera that's actually mounted on our helmet that just kind of lets us see in a degraded visibility environment, I guess is the best way to say that.
Okay.
So that image that's in our helmet can also be projected onto our displays or selected on our displays. So actually specifically for the ship, there's a couple different modes of that system where one of them is stoval, and it basically just gives you the top-down view of what's underneath the aircraft. And that's one of those initial lineup with the tramline things I use. So I'll put it's called DAS to stoval. So DAS to stoval with a little picture of it, and it'll basically just show the IR image directly below the aircraft. So I know, horseshoes and hand grenades, am I generally over the spot or am I off and I need to adjust myself? So.
And then you just work that into the scan you explained earlier.
Correct.
Where you're already looking outside?
Yep.
Okay. Question from Christian Schmelzer. The F-35B integrates advanced avionics and AI systems, according to Christian, to assist with flying and situational awareness. How do you balance the aircraft's automated systems and your own instincts and training when making high-stakes decisions, particularly during challenging landings at sea?
Yeah. So one of the biggest challenges coming from the Harrier to the F-35 was just the amount of information that's provided to you. It was a little bit of sensory overload at first until I developed the new scan pattern of, hey, what is presented to me right now, what is actually important to me, and what can I kind of scoff for a couple minutes later. So once we got over that, there's no AI involved in the system yet, but there are a lot of pilot relief modes that can just make the job of flying the aircraft not easier necessarily, but less cognitively taxing, I guess is the best way to put it. So you kind of equate it to, instead of being the 4-ship lead or even, as like a mission commander, when I was going through my mission commander upgrade, you can just kind of set the pilot relief modes and then sit back and kind of quarterback what's going on. Being able to see everyone on your displays in your link, or MATL is what we have for the F-35, just a different data link between the F-35s. So those will let you kind of just sit back and be able to, quarterback a little bit more than what you might be able to in legacy platforms. As far as getting back to the ship, the JPALs, that system, and being able to have the ship tell the jet, hey, here I am, here's how fast I'm going, here's what direction I'm going, that lends itself to being able to recover a little bit easier-ish to the ship. But at the same time, like any aviation community and automation, like it only works if you, one, actuate or activate the thing that you think you did, and two, that you've confirmed that it actually took and you don't think you're in one mode when you're in a completely different mode. We've seen issues at the ship before where, I won't throw out call signs, but on the CSG-21 deployment with the Queen Elizabeth, we ended up with an individual in a stable hover about 2 miles behind the ship, really bad spatial disorientation, and then that just led to a divert to a land-based site. So things still happen because, again, we still have men and women flying these aircraft, and we are fallible at times, especially at night behind the boat, in the worst possible weather we can find ourselves in. So
I'm glad now for the second time you've talked about humans being fallible. That is actually my LinkedIn profile little subtag is fallible human being, and I misspelled deliberately fallible.
Nice. It's my CRM instructor training being put to use there.
Outstanding. All right, Donovan Prater, Donovan, has a question, a comment. Naval and Marine aviators are some of the best pilots in the world, thank you.
Fact.
I owe him money. And complete one of the hardest jobs in aviation, landing on the boat.
Also fact.
So here's the question. As an LSO, what is your advice for briefs and debriefs? You walk into a room with some of the best pilots the Marine Corps has to offer. How do you tell them they did something wrong and instruct these extremely skilled aviators? Now, you already talked about you get the whole group together. So some of them might have ego or more experience. And there is still, I agree with Donovan here, some delivery that can really build a person up or tear them down. And it's all about the delivery, I feel like.
Mm-hmm. It all starts with kind of the initial training for CQ for the ready room and kind of setting the tone early. There was one squadron I was working with where the CO got up in front of everyone and is like, paddles is right no matter what. Like, that is it. If you're going to argue, don't argue in a debrief. Go talk to him after the fact or talk to her after the fact. Like, paddles is right. Listen to paddles. So when I heard that, I was like, all right, well, don't get a big ego here or anything because, like, again, you're still human. So we mess things up as paddles sometimes too. And unfortunately, LSOs have been causal factors at points in mishaps, over the course of our history. So, but it just comes down to establishing the whole, like, no matter how great of a tactician you are, if you can't come back to the ship and execute a safe landing, then, like, a lot of that was for nothing potentially. So kind of impressing upon the younger pilots, but also, my generation of transition pilots where ton of boat time in either the Harrier or, at the CVN and Hornet, it's just different. And, getting everyone to be a little bit humble is kind of a challenge in a ready room to begin with, let alone, being told like, hey man, those weren't the best passes today. You kind of need you to fix that tomorrow. But it's like any other mission we do. There's the plan, brief, debrief, or plan, debrief, execute, debrief,
That's right.
continuum. And everyone generally understands that, yes, we're going to critique in order to make each other better. I'm not going to just come off the top rope on everybody and like, you suck today and you suck today. Like you were okay. Nothing like that. But it comes down to the, mass debrief, kind of like we talked about. And then, any sort of safety of flight issues that come up are addressed either immediately to resolve the situation and bring it to a safe, logical conclusion, or once, flying's done for that day, okay, let's actually get everybody together and let's talk about from the LSO perspective, from the pilot perspective, from other flight members' perspective, like, hey, what just happened and how do we keep this from happening or keep this from turning into a mishap next time? I would say 99% of the pilots that I've CQ'd, there's no issue with taking feedback because like that's just who we are as a bunch of Type A personalities. The most uncomfortable thing I've had to do is tell O5s and O6s, like, I need you to fly 2 safe passes tomorrow or I cannot grant you a carrier qualification. And that's where it gets into a little bit of like, at the time I was a very junior major, not even a department head yet. And it was this is very uncomfortable because you outrank me and have a lot more flight time than I do and a lot more time at a ship than I do. But like at the end of the day, my job as the Stowell LSO is safe launch and recovery. And being able to tactfully do that is kind of one of the artwork sides of being an LSO as well. And really it's just laying out facts of like, this is what I saw, let's go look at the tapes. Hey, here in the tapes, let's compare what I think I saw to what your tapes are actually showing. Okay, cool. Kind of like I mentioned Mo Vaughn earlier, he had a saying of there's 2 sides to every story and the truth is usually somewhere in the middle. So kind of being able to bring everyone together and say like, here's what I saw from the tower. Here's what you guys saw from your tapes. All right, now we got the whole picture. How do we fix this? How do we, move forward? And then not focus so much on just the blocking and tackling of flying around the ship. So then we can, refine our tactical prowess, and then launching and recovering to the ship just becomes kind of second nature at that point. So.
And I think Donovan's question is an interesting one. And one of the things I feel like that you and I assume is that we do have this environment of professionalism. I mean, we sort of get weeded out as candidates, whether it's through officer selection or flight school or whatever, where once you're there, we're not just a smattering of people off the streets. We're military aviators, naval aviators specifically. And so we're pretty much, for the most part, like you said, open to feedback. We get it all the time. But also the people that are providing the feedback aren't just critics. It's not just that sucked and that was the end of it. It was, hey, that wasn't optimal and here's why. Here's a couple things. And so as a retired O5, if I can defend them, I would hope that they would understand while there is a rank difference, there's a positional leadership difference. And you're, as you said, the LSO, that 05, 06 should be listening because that is why you are there.
Yeah.
But you did say something about recordings I want to ask you about. Is there a recording from where you are up in the LSO?
There's not.
Okay, so it's just whatever was on the plane?
It's not like the flight deck camera that's out, as I think they have a feed at the platform of the flight deck camera. Yeah, no, it's all just eyeball calibration and just a function of watching just thousands of passes at this point at the ship. But
is there only one of you or are there 2?
So
at a time.
Yeah, so there is the primary LSO at any given point, and depending on what is going on, nighttime or bad weather or just initial CQ, there could be either a helper monkey scribe, as we call them, or it's just another qualified LSO where the understanding is like they are just there to back you up. But the primary designated LSO on the schedule is ultimately responsible for all the flying that day or recovering that day. So.
And I interrupted you. If you know what you were going to say.
It was something about the 05 and 06 thing. It wasn't a, there was no like, hey, shut up, know your place, Major. It was very well received. And like I messed that up. I need to do better tomorrow.
Joe Kunzler has a question that cracks me up because if you know Joe, you know he is the defender of the outlying field up at Whidbey Island.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
very outspoken about it. Way to go, Joe. Keep it up for the Growlers. But Joe's question, knowing that I was sitting down with you, says, do you still need outlying fields for the F-35B?
So that's an interesting one.
Yeah.
So because of, there's kind of a couple different parts to this. So FCLPs for the F-35, we are moving FCLPs to the FRS syllabus only as a one-time exposure event. So you get a day FCLP sim, a night FCLP sim, day FCLP flight, night FCLP flight. And in theory, you don't have to do FCLPs again. The trade-off there is that we are plussing up the CQ simulator syllabus. Again, kind of I don't want to say the ease of being able to fly around the ship that the F-35B provides, but the high fidelity of our simulators, our full mission simulators for the F-35B specifically, and the increased visual acuity over legacy simulators really lends itself to being able to develop that required sight picture before you actually go out to the ship. You know, we have outlying fields that have been constructed, or FCLP facilities that have been constructed as KNAS out in Yuma. We have one at the end of runway 05 in Beaufort, actually, which is single direction only. There's Ieshima for the MAG-12 Iwakuni squadrons, and then Bogue Field off of North Carolina, but it's not getting upgraded for F-35. So eventually it's going to be just those three. Now, Yuma in the summertime, turns out it's hot, and being hot is not good for hovering aircraft, so that gets used maybe about 5 or 6 months out of the year just for F-35B specific stuff. But once we do that initial exposure event in the FRS, then we can kind of focus on, you know, additional scenarios that we can present with those increased number of CQ sims. Part of the problem is you have to fly a pattern that is slightly different from what you fly at the ship, basically from about 0.3 miles behind the ship into the VL. And some of that has to do with the concept of hot gas ingestion, which, think of it as like all that jet exhaust that's blowing down. Eventually, as we slow down, it goes out in front of the aircraft, up and then back into the intakes, which decreases our performance. So trying to stay out of that, we have to come in higher than what we normally would at the ship. So there's a little bit of like, yes, it's a good procedural training code up to a point, but at a certain point you have to realize like, okay, now I am purposefully deviating from the normal pattern I would fly in order to execute this VL and at least see some semblance of the sight picture that I would at the ship. When we were getting ready for CSG-21 on the Queen Elizabeth, the Brits don't fly FCLPs at all. They have their simulator trainer, and then they actually have a full motion simulator up at BAE Wharton there that they'll go and fly before they get ready for the ship. So we kind of took some of the lessons learned from that and are also applying it to kind of what we're learning from the last couple F-35B deployments on Muse to figure out the most efficient and optimal way to train pilots out at the ship. So.
Okay. Tom Oates wants to know, what's a wave-off like when you have a relatively stationary aircraft? And if I may take a chance at this answer for you, I'm inclined to say, well, you go from stationary to moving forward, Tom. Mm-hmm. But I guess based on our conversation earlier, maybe what it's like is, because now I'm much lower on gas, and I know it's going to take me a little while to come around. But
yeah, so a couple, like we'll call it 3 different scenarios for wave-offs. You'd have semi-jet-borne, so you're still, either in the process of your deceleration or you've just initiated your decel and something's happened to where the LSO calls a wave-off. More often than not, it's the heavy wave-off. So you told me what your fuel state was at the beam. I know just based on math and science that you're still going to be too heavy by the time you get to be in the ship, so I'm just going to wave you off and help you burn down a little bit more ahead of time. That's just an easy, like, hey, wave off, heavy. We have the wave off lights, the cut lights, like they do on the IFLAWs on the CVNs. So then that's just a matter of them, just going back around pattern altitude and turning back around to try again. There's the low-speed semi-jet-borne where you're coming up to the back end of the ship and something happens and the LSO knows hey, it's going to be a little bit longer, or it's like hey, I need to wave this guy off and divert him or her because of whatever's happening on the ship right now. That gets a little more emotional, but not too bad still. Now the transition is, okay, I was slowing down, now I've got to speed back up. get back from either low-speed semi-jet borne to high-speed semi-jet borne. I got to convert back out to CTOL. Okay, now I'm a CTOL aircraft again, and then go to wherever I need to. But the way I brief it to the pilots is, if you get the wave off, just paddle, pull, establish pause, ready to climb, take cut to port, don't overfly the ship, and then slowly accelerate out once you climb up to pattern altitude. And even towards the back end of the ship, it's like, all right, well, got to wave off. I'll try it again here in a second. But the wave off from the stable hover is the one that's kind of hard to swallow sometimes. Of like, you're already there, you made it to the ship, you're in hover, your coast speed to the ship. Again, what is going to be the higher risk thing of you being a lower fuel state, where now you were just in a hover looking at the giant ship, and now you got to go all the way back around and you're at the beam, like, man, that's a tiny ship again. I got to try and decel to a hover, beam it one more time now that I'm staring at warning lights saying like, hey, you're pretty low on fuel. So it's that risk decision of, is this situation going to resolve itself in a timely manner and I just keep them hovering and beam the ship, or like, maybe we got to give the deck crew a little bit more time, and maybe that 2-3 minutes in the pattern is going to be enough to resolve whatever the situation is. The other out is, I said spot 7 and 9 are the two primaries. Well, spot 6, just forward of that, is an emergency use only, to where something happened on 7 and 9, aircraft in the way, we just can't get them out of the way, whatever it is. We can, in emergencies only, land spot 6 just forward of 7. And that is just one of those, like, the flight deck hasn't been reinforced. It doesn't have the thermally sprayed non-skid over it to account for the higher temperature exhaust gases of the 35, the higher just jet exhaust pressure. So that's one of those, like, split decision, hey, boss, I'm going to take him to 6. And that's basically going to, like, shut the flight deck down for a little bit until we can sort out whatever's going on there. But it's one of those where you have an out. So I would probably potentially lean more towards landing a guy on spot 6 or a gal on spot 6 than I would waving them off from a stable hover, as opposed to just like, hey, check forward. All right, there's spot 6, cross. All right, land, and then kind of move on with the day from there. And then that would go into the like, okay, how identifying what happened, what drove us to using the emergency use only landing spot, like deck crew, was it pilots, was it whatever.
You debrief it just like you do the mission.
Just like you would, yeah. And that's one of those real time with the air boss, and that's like probably one of the most important things I can convey to any LSOs that are under training is the relationship that you as a mid-grade 03 establish with the air boss, because he's just there 5-6 feet from you the entire time you're in the tower. Like, that will pay huge dividends across the entire deployment. And once they get over the fact that they're having to sometimes have uncomfortable conversations with the post-command 05 air boss, like, hey, congratulations, you're an LSO. That's nature of the beast at this point, so get over it.
You're both human beings.
Yep.
So yeah. All right, last question is from Anthony Lombardo. Would a STOVL LSO ever be forward deployed to a FARP, a forward air refueling point?
Great question. So we do have a qualification. Again, it was a copy and paste from the Harrier, but the landing site supervisor, basically land paddles is what I jokingly call it. And in the Harrier, we would have a backpack with a radio in it, and we'd just be standing there on center line of the FARP, essentially controlling left and right lineup, because the idea is that you're landing to like narrow taxiways or narrow roadways where you weren't as much concerned with the glide slope. You had enough room to get stopped if you were doing a slow landing or what we would call a rolling vertical landing. And then your left and right lineup was the biggest kind of risk of that evolution. That's a qualification that's still kind of being developed for us, and that's an additional line of effort for the STOVL LSO school, because we are going to the whole expeditionary advanced base operations mindset of, like, the ships might not always be available, but there could be a fuel bladder and some missiles here at this random site. So how do we get in there? Unfortunately, we don't have enough LSOs in the 35 community to begin with. So having also LSOs we could send out to random FARPs to recover F-35s is, at this point, kind of a long shot. But once we get the school and the course and all that developed, I think it'll be a lot easier to manage that. But having that either competent pilot just standing there on the roadway saying, like, yep, check left, check right, check left, all right, hey, you're on center, touchdown, and then you just run out of the way with your backpack on as they pass, and then you step back out so you can land the next one. That's basically the gist of being the landing site supervisor.
All
so.
right. Well, and that pilot has to get there somehow, but
Correct.
maybe that's
Well,
another
swim or something. I don't know.
Oh, goodness. Well, is that what brings you to San Diego? Because you're normally in Beaufort. Are you trying to set up the school out here, or?
No. So ultimately, the LSO school, or the Stouffville LSO school, will be set up in Beaufort, inside the pilot training center, or basically our sim facility in Beaufort. Right now, our interim solution is actually at Pax River at the manned flight simulator facility. There is a simulator capability, which is kind of the standard dome and projector, where they've just built the environment of being inside of PryFly, and it also connects to the linked F-35 simulator that's in there. So you can throw a pilot in the sim, have them fly around, and you control them real time while you're standing there in PryFly. It also has the ability to record passes. So, we did a number of our best nominal pass that we could fly, and for the start of the course, or the start of the simulator phase of the course, we'll just sit there for about 45 minutes to an hour and hit play, and you just get an aircraft at the 180 all the way down, vertical landing, spot 7 or spot 9. Because one of the biggest challenges to making an LSO how we have it right now is it's 100% on-the-job training. So you have to watch 25 passes before you can control 25 passes daytime, and then you rinse and repeat for nighttime as well. So you're talking about upwards of 100 vertical landings at the ship to make one basically qualified LSO. You have 18 pilots, you got a CQ, 6 day landings for a day CQ, 4 night for a night CQ. So you're talking about 10 per, so maybe 180 in just the CQ evolution itself, total vertical landings. So you can make almost 2 LSOs. When you have the back-to-back boat deployments for some, people either go off to do something else, whether it's in Orange and Whites or the Test World or something like that. So the biggest benefit and the kind of primary responsibilities for developing an LSO school is being able to just make LSOs more efficiently, again, more standardized, and ultimately have it just become another qual that people want to get. So that way we don't have to worry about just shuffling people back and forth between squadrons in order to staff deployments with enough LSOs. There's a little bit of a stigma of like, if you get an LSO, you're just going to do boat deployments for your entire career. And having done 4 boat deployments myself and having almost, I think, a total of 3 years at sea right now, that's kind of true until the LSO school is a thing. But again, we're just trying to make it another qualification that people want to get. It is essentially a flight leadership qualification because, I think in Jamboy's episode, one of the listener questions was talking about emergency procedures and how you handle that. You're essentially the ODO as well and the book reader, and usually you don't find out something's wrong with the aircraft until they're making their beam call and they try to convert and they got a bunch of caution lights and warnings of like, well, the jet didn't do what it was supposed to, now what do we do? So it's a flight leadership qualification essentially where you should be a section lead. If you're going to be an instructor, you should be a division lead because you need to have that experience with the aircraft and that comfort with systems knowledge to be able to help diagnose whatever the problem is and come up with the logical conclusion or sound decision making to recover the aircraft or divert the aircraft, and that just kind of comes with time in the jet. But so all that to say, Pax River is the interim solution right now for the LSO school, but Beaufort will be the permanent one.
What's the future for this whole concept? Is it that every time F-35Bs deploy, there's at least a couple qualified through the school LSOs with all the information that they've learned from Harriers to F-35Bs and all the stuff we talked about today? I mean, these guys have some sort of, and gals have some sort of qualification that, hey, you're good to control these aircraft.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So The idea that we're kind of going with right now is whoever the next squadron in the chute is, like 74 5-year champions, we're going to put them through Stouffville LSO school, and then I basically go out and do fleet support a couple times a year. So I'll go on the workups or on the CQ periods with them, and then sign off whatever ones that I can. There's a couple training LSOs ideally there'd be a couple training LSOs at each mag. Not entirely the case right now, which is why I go do fleet support more than my wife wants me to. But ideally, there's the MAG LSOs as well, kind of your CAG paddle equivalent, there to go out with the squadrons that are in workups to sign off, or be like the final sign off for the LSOs that are training there. Okay. Long term, having that simulator capability in Beaufort. Having multiple cockpits that link to the simulator capability and Honestly, probably going the like virtual reality, augmented reality route, where you in the F-35 cockpit have the goggles on and you're flying in the virtual world. The LSOs that are in PryFly see PryFly around them in the goggles, and there's some sort of like semi-permanent structure so that you walk into or you bump your head against the plexiglass of the windows or something like that. But more from a real estate perspective and not having a whole lot of it, going that route, I think, is going to be what makes the most sense for Stouffville LSO School in the future. And some of the things being discussed are potentially some of those simulator setups at each F-35B base to potentially serve as like a sustainment training opportunity for LSOs. But really, in order to fix the immediate problem of not enough in the community, getting that established in Beaufort is kind of, I think, the highest priority for the Stouffville LSO School specifically. And when Colonel Vaughn said, hey, start a school, no money, no real estate, figure it out, the CVN LSO Schoolhouse was actually a ton of help. Winkle, Jilson, before he left there, I basically came out for their Air Boss seminar and was like, here's an external hard drive. Can you please tell me everything you guys do so I'm not reinventing the wheel? We sometimes like to do things the hard way in the Marine Corps, and that was one of those things I figured, like, well, you guys have been doing this for about 70 years, so you probably have a good idea of how to, teach people how to do this. So wasn't trying to reinvent any wheels or anything like that. So they've been a huge help, actually, in standing up this thing, which is kind of why I stole the patch idea slightly, just made some Marine Corps changes to it. Yeah, so hopefully that's going to be the long-term solution, and hopefully we have an answer on a more permanent solution for it by 26 or 27 before I disappear for good. So.
Well, and that's my next question, because are you like we need this thing and we'll have a billet of someone who's leading it, or is it, hey, we need this thing and SAC, you're it until it's like up and running kind of thing?
That's a great question. So for stability for the family, it'd be nice to just stay there all the way through retirement, which is in November of 27, not that I'm counting, but no, I'm just kidding. I'll stick around as long as they let me fly. So yes, ideally, I can stick around to where we get a signed order formally establishing the school. We have the manpower structure established to where it is an actual BIC for the OIC of the Stouffville LSO School, and then potentially having the funding in place for some sort of simulator capability down there in Beaufort. I think if I can get to the point where those three things are at least a lot more sure than what they are right now, to not just hand an empty turnover binder to the next person and say Godspeed, I think that would be most ideal, and then go off and do whatever the Marine Corps needs me to do next. But
okay. Well, on the one hand, it sounded like you were looking forward to November 27, but if they'll let you fly, you'll stick around, huh?
We'll see.
Depends,
yeah, it depends.
Right.
I just hit the 22-year mark in October.
Well,
so.
that's counting your
it's counting the Air Force
airman,
time,
which we already did the call sign thing. So I think we're done. Cut.
Yep.
No, that's good. Well, you seem to me very genuine. Like you believe in this. Like let's make the school, make it good, and save people. And dare I say, there's plenty of videos on YouTube of sensational regular carrier landings going badly. Mm-hmm. You don't hear of too many in your world, but maybe I just don't tune into that. But right, I mean, we still want to do a good job, and it still can be very catastrophic if we're careless. So we need the school. We need properly trained pilots to do it.
Yep. Yeah, cool. And probably one of the most satisfying things is not just like CQing pilots or granting them their CQ designations, but also just getting an LSO all the way from the school through signed off and being like, all right, it's a big world out there. Good luck. Let me know if you need anything. But the kind of saying of the Latin at the top of the LSO or the Stouffville LSO patch, noli rem futuere, is the kind of Marine Corps take on rectum non bustus. Again, completely unofficial patch. So if I get a lot of angry emails from higher up saying, take that off, what are you doing? It's probably going to be the outcome of this. But basically it just means don't screw it up in Latin. But there's probably a word I shouldn't say.
You already did earlier.
So. Oh, yeah, I did. All right. So, all right, don't fuck it up is the saying. So it's a nod to John Glenn, who said that before he got shot into space. Also a huge proponent of the carrier-based fighter platform. So that's my story with why we have that. And it's just standard Marine Corps motivation whenever you ask, hey, I'm about to go do this thing. What do I need to know? Like, yeah, don't fuck it up. So.
So true. Awesome. Well, Zach, this has been a lot of fun. We've asked about the future of this and you and the call sign. I guess I'll just leave it at this, and you can have the last word. I try to always do that for my guests. What do the listeners and viewers need to know that maybe I didn't ask you about the short takeoff vertical landing signal officer that you are, sounds like, doing a good job of getting set up formally in the Marine Corps, and what else is there?
Well, for one, thanks for having me on here to kind of get the good word of what us redheaded stepchildren LSOs do on the amphibs. I think that was just one of the biggest things of either people not knowing we exist or not really knowing what we do, and really trying to impress upon the younger pilots that are especially getting their LSO qualifications of, like, you need to understand the amount of responsibility and, I don't want to say power, but the amount of authority that you are potentially delegated from either the squadron CO or the ship CO at times in the execution of that flight schedule and executing the air plan. But the biggest thing is just us in the F-35B community catching up with where the CVN world is as far as formalized training of LSOs go. It was always OJT previously in the Harrier community. It had always been talked about of like, hey, there should really be like a more formal kind of setting for this. But it was one of those things where we only had two bases that had Harriers, so there was either the East Coast way of doing things or the West Coast way of doing things, and it was always aligned with NATOPS for the most part. So it wasn't as much of an issue as where now we have 5 different bases with F-35Bs, all potentially capable of supporting shipboard deployments here over the course of the next few years. So just having that academic and simulator capability and a formal training course to standardize the way we do things across the F-35B STOL LSO community is probably just the biggest thing I want to impress upon our future as the STOL LSOs going forward. The conversations were had in the 60s or 70s when the OLS first came out of like, oh, we got an OLS, we don't need LSOs anymore, and then mishap rates spiked. Well, all the automation that we have in the F-35, like, again, there's still people in the cockpit that could still potentially mess it up, and then the LSOs, that final backstop to potentially salvage a bad situation, or hopefully salvage a bad situation. Yeah. So.
Well, and I forgot one more thing before I do let you have the last word, but since you've spent some time with me now, I'd like to bestow upon you the Fighter Pilot Podcast patch that says guest. And I noticed you conveniently have some empty Velcro on your sleeve there.
Thank you very much.
I'm sure you can wear that around, even though it'll take us. That's right. It'll take us a little while to produce this, but we're still going to call you a guest. So awesome.
Here we go.
Well, Zach, this has been a lot of fun, and good luck in all these endeavors and everything. And I hope you get everything you're looking for as far as all the permissions and everything else. And yeah, I think once you gain some traction, I think people will only come around because it's going to make everything you're doing safer. So it's been a really interesting discussion. So thanks for reaching out and making sure we got here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks for watching this episode of the Fighter Pilot Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. I still do every episode. Now, as a quick reminder, we try to explain all the jargon, but in case you missed something, head on over to fighterpilotpodcast.com, where we have a glossary of all the different terms we use. And while you're there, check out some of the cool merchandise that we offer. For additional content and to help support the show, please go check out our Patreon page. We'll see you next week.